In the late 1930s, Japan stood on the edge of a new empire. Victories in Manchuria and China had turned its military leaders into gods of conquest, and the imperial army believed its destiny was written among the clouds. The age of the biplane was ending, and a new generation of aircraft would decide who ruled the skies of Asia. Inside the Nakajima Aircraft Company, a young and brilliant engineer named Hideo Itokawa, a man who would later be called Japan's father of modern aeronautics, was handed a mission that bordered on the impossible: to design a fighter so fast, so agile, and so alive in the hands of its pilot that it would make every Western aircraft obsolete. The codename was Ki-43, and its purpose was simple: to embody the spirit of the warrior in flight. Itokawa had already seen what the Army wanted in its previous fighter, the Ki-27 Nate. It was light, graceful, and easy to fly, but it lacked range and speed. The Army demanded something new, something capable of reaching distant battlefields and outturning every enemy plane it met. The result would become the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, Falcon in Japanese, a machine that would come to define Japan's early air war. From the beginning, Itokawa's design philosophy went against everything Western engineers believed. While the Americans and Europeans were adding armor, heavier guns, and self-sealing fuel tanks, Japan went the opposite direction. They stripped away protection to chase perfection. If the pilot is skilled, Itokawa told a colleague, he will not need armor. It was the ultimate expression of Japan's Bushido code, faith that courage and precision could triumph over metal and fire. The aircraft's frame was a masterpiece of minimalism. Itokawa used the lightest aluminum available, shaving off every unnecessary ounce until the Hayabusa weighed barely 2 metric tons. Its wings were thin and elegant, its fuselage narrow and streamlined, its control surfaces balanced to the touch of a fingertip. When test pilot Tadashi Sasaki first took it into the sky in January 1939, the plane seemed to dance. It turned with almost supernatural grace, completing a full 360-degree loop in seconds. He said, "It felt alive, as if it knew what I wanted before I moved." Yet behind this beauty was danger. The first prototypes suffered structural failures in steep dives. The lightweight wings flexed too much, and on several occasions the tail nearly tore away. Engineers reinforced the frame with additional spars, but every gram added meant a loss of agility. Itokawa faced an agonizing balance between survival and performance, and his decision was clear: agility would always come first. To achieve the range demanded by the Imperial Army, the Hayabusa carried extra fuel in thin aluminum tanks, but these tanks were unsealed, meaning a single bullet could ignite them instantly. There was no cockpit armor, no bulletproof glass, no protection for the pilot at all. The plane's only defense was to avoid being hit. Itokawa described it not as a war machine, but as a bird of prey, something meant to strike, not endure. When the final pre-production model was rolled out in late 1940, senior Army officers gathered at the Nakajima plant for a private demonstration. The fighter rose effortlessly from the runway, climbed in a perfect spiral, and then dove straight toward the spectators before pulling up so sharply the pilot's head nearly struck the canopy. The crowd gasped. One officer whispered, "This will conquer the skies of Asia." Another smiled and said, "It is not a plane, it is a sword." The Imperial Army ordered mass production. The first Sentai received the Hayabusas in the spring of 1941, and pilots began training with enthusiasm and awe. They had never flown anything so light, so responsive, so pure. "You could fight with 2 fingers," one recalled. Many painted personal emblems on their fuselages: hawks, dragons, and cherry blossoms, symbols of their bond with the machine. The Hayabusa was not a tool to them, it was a companion, a reflection of their own spirit. At the same time, foreign observers, especially the Americans, had no idea what was coming. Intelligence reports from China described Japanese fighters that could outturn anything in the sky. The U.S. dismissed them as exaggerations. Western pilots believed heavier planes with armor and firepower would always dominate. They did not yet understand that Japan was preparing to fight a different kind of war, one based on speed, precision, and sacrifice rather than protection and power. By December 1941, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor and launched offensives across Southeast Asia, the Hayabusa was ready. It flew with the 64th and 50th Sentai over Burma, the Philippines, and Malaya. Allied pilots first saw them through clouds of burning oil and tracer fire and assumed they were Zeros. But these were not Navy fighters. They were the Army's own Falcons, agile and lethal. As one RAF pilot in Burma wrote after surviving his first encounter, "They came out of the sun, 3 of them spinning and climbing in ways that defied gravity. We turned to meet them, but they vanished. A moment later, one was on my tail. It was like fighting a ghost." The Hayabusa had arrived, and for the next year it would dominate the skies of Asia. Yet hidden within its triumph was the flaw that would one day destroy it. The same lightness that gave it wings would also seal its fate. For now, though, Japan believed it had built the perfect fighter, swift, graceful, and unstoppable. The Falcon had spread its wings, and the empire of the rising sun soared with it.
The year 1942 dawned with the rising sun blazing across Asia. Japan's armies rolled through Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies like a tide no one could stop. And above every battlefield, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa reigned supreme. The fighter's sleek silhouette became the signature of the Imperial Army Air Force's triumph, a flash of silver wings slicing through the humid skies of Burma, the jungles of New Guinea, and the beaches of the Philippines. To the men who flew it, the Hayabusa was not just an aircraft, it was an extension of their own instincts, a divine weapon guided by human spirit. From the moment it entered combat, Allied pilots found themselves outclassed. Against the British in Burma, the Hayabusa made a mockery of the rugged Hawker Hurricane. The Hurricane could outdive the Japanese plane, but it couldn't turn with it, not even close. In dogfights, the Hayabusa danced in tight circles, twisting behind its enemy in seconds. Japanese pilots, trained since peacetime in the art of turning combat, Senkai-sen, exploited that agility ruthlessly. They could outmaneuver anything in the sky. One Allied pilot wrote after barely escaping, "It was like fighting a swallow with a hammer." When American P-40 Warhawks met the Hayabusa over the Philippines, they were shocked. The P-40 was faster in a straight line, but clumsy in a turning fight. American pilots, accustomed to brute force tactics, soon realized that engaging a Ki-43 head-on was suicide. They could flip inside your turn before you knew they'd started it, recalled Lieutenant Charles Older of the Flying Tigers, who later became one of the first American aces in China. You'd look left, and they were already there. The Hayabusa's dominance came from more than agility. Its wings were equipped with unique combat flaps, small devices that allowed it to tighten its turns even further without stalling. In the right hands, this made it almost untouchable. The plane could perform a vertical loop in less than 10 seconds, recover from spins effortlessly, and climb like a bird on instinct. It could turn on a 10-yen coin, one instructor boasted, and he wasn't exaggerating. At the height of its success, the Hayabusa became the terror of Southeast Asia. In March 1942, over the skies of Rangoon, the 64th Sentai, led by Major Tateo Kato, shot down more than 15 Allied aircraft in a single day. Kato himself became a living legend, his white-striped Ki-43 known and feared by name. When he was killed later that year, his squadron painted his insignia on their tails, vowing to fight as Kato's Fox. To the Japanese public, these aces were heroes of mythic proportion, their duels chronicled in newspapers as tales of modern samurai. For months, Allied morale plummeted. In every encounter, reports repeated the same story. They outturned us. They outclimbed us. They disappeared into the sun. The Ki-43's graceful maneuvering and the skill of its pilots created an illusion of invincibility. American and British intelligence, desperate to identify the fighter, initially confused it with the Navy's Mitsubishi Zero. Both aircraft shared similar traits: light structure, long range, and lethal agility. But in reality, they came from two separate branches of the Japanese war machine. The Ki-43 belonged to the Army, the Zero to the Navy. Together, they ruled the Pacific sky like twin dragons. Yet even in its glory, the Hayabusa carried a secret flaw. Beneath its beauty lay fragility. Allied pilots soon learned that a few well-placed hits could tear it apart. Bullets from the P-40's 6.50 caliber machine guns often ignited its unprotected fuel tanks or shredded its unarmored cockpit. American intelligence began circulating leaflets titled "The Oscar's Weakness," advising pilots to avoid turning fights and instead dive and attack from above. Slowly, the illusion began to crack. Still, during 1942, those weaknesses were far from decisive. In campaign after campaign, from the skies of Java to the jungles of New Guinea, the Hayabusa dominated. Allied airfields burned, convoys vanished, and pilots returned home shaken. The Hayabusa's presence alone was enough to unsettle entire formations. The U.S. 5th Air Force dubbed it the Angel of Death. But behind its triumphs, Japanese engineers at Nakajima were already uneasy. The Ki-43's speed barely reached 320 miles per hour, adequate for 1941, but dangerously slow by the standards of 1943. Its twin 12.7mm machine guns lacked the punch to down heavy bombers, and the light structure that made it nimble also made it impossible to upgrade without losing balance. Itokawa and his team began sketching modifications: stronger engines, better firepower, armor plating. But each change violated the very philosophy that had made the plane great. The Army wanted the spirit of the falcon, not the body of an eagle. Meanwhile, in the skies above New Guinea, the first cracks were already showing. American P-38 Lightnings entered combat, and their twin engines and diving speed proved lethal. A Lightning could climb away faster than any Japanese fighter could follow. In their after-action reports, U.S. pilots described the Ki-43's agility with a mix of respect and contempt. They can dance around you all day, but one burst, and they're dust. The Hayabusa's reign was not yet over, but the winds of war were shifting. Japan still held the initiative, but America was learning, adapting, producing, and improving at a rate no nation in history had ever matched. The Falcon still ruled the jungle skies, but the storm was coming. In 1942, Japanese pilots still believed they could win the war with courage and flight skill. They bowed before takeoff, whispered a prayer to their ancestors, and took off into clouds streaked with tropical sunlight, certain the Empire's wings would never falter. They didn't yet know that the same lightness that made the Hayabusa soar would soon become the weight that dragged it down.
By mid-1943, the war in the Pacific had changed. The unstoppable expansion of the rising sun had stalled on the jungle ridges of New Guinea and the coral reefs of the Solomons. The Imperial Army Air Force, once master of the skies, now faced an enemy growing stronger by the month: faster planes, better pilots, and endless resources. And in that shifting tide came one of the most revealing moments of the entire air war: the day the Americans finally got their hands on a nearly intact Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa. It happened almost by accident. In April 1943, during a skirmish over the jungles near Buna, New Guinea, a Japanese pilot of the 11th Sentai took heavy damage from a P-40 Warhawk. Rather than crash, he managed to glide his crippled Ki-43 onto a grassy clearing behind Allied lines. The pilot was killed trying to destroy his machine, but failed. When U.S. troops reached the site, they were stunned. The aircraft was almost untouched, a perfect specimen of the mysterious Japanese fighter that had haunted them for 2 years. The Americans carefully disassembled it, shipped it by transport to Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, and began one of the most important technical examinations of the Pacific War. When the engineers and intelligence officers first opened the panels, they were speechless. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The windscreen was just thin plexiglass. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing, just unprotected aluminum bladders that would ignite with a single tracer round. The internal structure looked impossibly fragile. Narrow ribs, minimal bulkheads, and paper-thin skin. One mechanic tapped the fuselage and said it sounded like a tin can. But then they weighed it, barely 5,700 pounds empty. Suddenly, the impossible agility of the Oscar made sense. American test pilot Captain Ralph F. Watson was chosen to fly it. He said, "It looked like a toy. You could almost pick it up and throw it." On his first takeoff, the plane lifted effortlessly before he even reached half throttle. In the air, it responded to every touch instantly. It could roll, loop, and climb with a grace he had never felt before. After landing, he stepped out, grinning and pale. He said, "It flies like silk and dies like paper." The American U.S. Army Air Force's engineers were equally astonished by the aircraft's simplicity. It had no hydraulic system. The landing gear and flaps were operated by cables and hand levers. The guns, two 12.7mm HO-103s, were synchronized mechanically, not electrically. The propeller pitch was controlled manually. Everything about the plane reflected an obsession with weight reduction. The Ki-43's engine, a Nakajima HA-25, was reliable but modest, producing only about 980 horsepower. Yet, because the airframe was so light, the plane still climbed like a rocket. As they studied it, a realization dawned on the Americans. The Hayabusa was not a machine built for war as they understood it. It was built for duels. It was a swordsman's weapon, designed for one-on-one combat in clear skies, not for surviving against swarms of bombers and heavy guns. Its very design philosophy was alien to Western thinking. American fighters like the P-47 and P-38 were heavy, armored, and built to bring pilots home. The Hayabusa was built on the Bushido ideal, that honor lay not in survival, but in performance. The test reports from Brisbane were forwarded to Washington under the title Technical Evaluation of Captured Ki-43 Type 1 Fighter Army Model 1. The summary was both admiring and damning. Excellent maneuverability and rate of climb achieved through extreme lightness. Structural protection and pilot safety are virtually non-existent. Design emphasizes offense at the expense of all defense. When these findings reached frontline squadrons, American tactics shifted overnight. Pilots were instructed never to engage a Hayabusa in a turning fight. Instead, they were to dive from altitude, fire in one pass, and climb away, using speed and armor as shields. The results were immediate. Where once Allied pilots had been slaughtered trying to match the Japanese in agility, they now fought on their own terms. For the Japanese engineers back at Nakajima, this shift was devastating. Reports from the front line spoke of mounting losses. The Ki-43's once legendary agility was no longer enough. The lightweight structure that had once been its advantage had become a liability against the heavier, faster American fighters now flooding the Pacific, the P-38 Lightning, the F-6 Hellcat, and the P-47 Thunderbolt. Still, in Tokyo, the Army clung to the myth. They ordered the production of improved variants, the Ki-43-2, and later the Ki-43-3, with slightly thicker skin, a more powerful HA-115 engine, and armor plate behind the pilot. But it was too little, too late. Every improvement added weight, eroding the very quality that defined the Hayabusa. The plane was trapped by its own perfection. At Eagle Farm, American pilots continued testing the captured aircraft through the summer of 1943. They painted U.S. stars on its wings and flew mock combat against P-40s and P-38s. Again and again, the results were the same. At low speed, the Hayabusa could turn inside anything. But once the American planes used altitude and diving speed, the Oscar was defenseless. The illusion of invincibility evaporated. By the end of the year, the Ki-43 had been demystified. What had once been a ghost in the sky was now just another machine. Elegant, brave, but fatally outdated. And yet, for all their criticism, the Americans could not help but feel a grudging admiration. As one engineer wrote in his final report, "This airplane is not built for survival. It is built for grace. It is the most perfect expression of a nation's soul ever put into flight." In that single captured airframe, the Americans had uncovered more than engineering. They had seen into Japan's war philosophy itself. The Hayabusa had been designed not merely to fight, but to embody belief. And by 1943, belief alone was no longer enough to keep a fighter or an empire in the air.
By late 1943, the Pacific skies had become a proving ground where two visions of air power collided: Japan's faith in the spirit of the pilot and America's faith in the science of the machine. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, once the terror of Burma and the Philippines, now faced an enemy that had learned, adapted, and industrialized the art of war. Its once graceful form was meeting the hard edge of steel. The shift began subtly. The U.S. Army Air Forces had studied every weakness of the Hayabusa from the captured aircraft at Eagle Farm. Combat reports were rewritten, pilot manuals revised. American flyers were drilled never to turn with the Oscar. Instead, they used altitude, speed, and coordinated teamwork. In the skies over Wewak, Rabaul, and the Arakan front, new predators arrived: the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang. Heavier, faster, and armed to the teeth, they changed the very physics of air combat. The first to meet this new reality were the pilots of the 64th Sentai in Burma. In the spring of 1943, they took off in gleaming Ki-43-2Is with cherry blossom emblems on their tails, expecting another season of victory. Instead, they found themselves ambushed by lightnings diving out of the sun at nearly 400 miles per hour. The Hayabusas tried to twist away, looping and rolling as they always had, but the Americans simply climbed out of reach, circled, and dove again. Within minutes, entire formations vanished. In one report, a Japanese survivor wrote bitterly, "They come down like thunder, strike once, and vanish. Our bullets cannot reach them." The engineers at Nakajima responded with desperate innovation. The Ki-43-2I introduced a more powerful HA-115 engine, a three-blade, constant-speed propeller, and optional armor plate behind the pilot's seat. Some versions even featured self-sealing fuel tanks, a long-overdue concession to survivability. The Army boasted that these changes would restore the fighter's supremacy. But when the new variant met the Hellcat and Corsair over the Philippines, the truth was brutal. Each improvement made the plane heavier, dulling the knife's edge that had once defined it. The Hayabusa could no longer climb as fast or turn as sharply. The balance between man and machine had been broken. Even so, its pilots fought with astonishing courage. In the defense of New Guinea, squadrons of Ki-43s took on formations of B-25s and P-38s despite being hopelessly outgunned. Lieutenant Satoshi Anabuki, one of Japan's leading aces, scored more than 50 victories flying the Hayabusa, often attacking bombers head-on. He once returned to base with over 300 bullet holes in his aircraft. "She brought me home," he told his mechanics, patting the bullet-riddled fuselage. But for every survivor like him, dozens never returned. By mid-1944, the air war had become a slaughter. In the Battle of Imphal,
Japanese pilots launched desperate missions to support ground forces trapped in the Burmese jungle. Fuel was scarce, spare parts almost non-existent, yet they flew. Many took off knowing they would not have enough fuel to return. American radar stations tracked them easily, and Allied fighters pounced from above. The once proud Hayabusa was now a silhouette of courage and futility, a falcon fighting against a hurricane. Over the Philippines, the final act began. On October 20th, 1944, as U.S. forces landed at Leyte, waves of Ki-43s from the 1st Air Division scrambled to intercept the invasion fleet. Facing F-6F Hellcats and P-38 Lightnings, the result was inevitable. They came in beautiful formation, one U.S. Navy pilot remembered. But when they met our fire, they just disintegrated. Some Japanese pilots, realizing the hopelessness, rammed their enemies intentionally, early echoes of the kamikaze ethos that would soon consume the entire Japanese air arm. The Hayabusa had entered the war as a symbol of mastery. Now it was becoming a symbol of sacrifice. Its delicate frame, once a marvel of aerodynamic artistry, turned to ash under the weight of modern warfare. Japanese ground crews salvaged parts from wrecked planes to keep others flying. Engines were stripped, propellers reused, wings patched with bamboo. "We fly ghosts now," one mechanic wrote in his diary in 1944. "Their hearts are strong, but their bodies are gone." And yet, even in defeat, the Hayabusa retained a strange beauty. Allied pilots often remarked on it. They respected their opponents, many of whom chose death over capture. One Hellcat pilot later said, "They flew with a kind of grace we couldn't understand. You could feel they believed in something we didn't." By the end of 1944, Japan's skies were no longer its own. American bombers roamed freely, and the Ki-43s that rose to meet them were relics of another era. Still they climbed, fragile birds rising into a storm of metal, because that is what they had been built to do. The Hayabusa's story was reaching its tragic climax. The empire that had built it was crumbling, its factories burning, its pilots dying faster than they could be trained. But even as the flames spread, one truth endured. The Ki-43 was never merely a machine. It was a dream, one that believed human spirit could outfly the laws of physics.
By early 1945, the skies over the Pacific had become a graveyard for Japan's dreams. Once, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa had ruled those skies, swift, graceful, unstoppable. Now, its fragile wings carried young men into certain death. The Falcon, that had once been the pride of the Imperial Army Air Force, was flying into extinction, not from failure of courage, but from the collapse of an entire nation's ability to keep pace with a new kind of war. In the final months of the Pacific conflict, Japan's airfields were reduced to mud, jungle clearings, and shattered runways. The Allied advance, from the Philippines to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, had left the empire with no safe haven. The few Ki-43s still operational were often flown by boys barely out of flight school. Many had fewer than 40 hours of total flight time before combat. Gone were the seasoned aces of Burma and New Guinea, the men who had once turned air combat into art. Now, desperation was all that remained. The Hayabusa, still in production as the Ki-43-3A, had been given one last upgrade, a 1,230 horsepower Ha-115-2 engine, two 12.7mm Ho-103 machine guns, and a top speed of around 358 miles per hour. It was faster, stronger, and marginally better protected, but in 1945, it might as well have been made of paper. Against the U.S. Navy's F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and the P-51 Mustang, the Ki-43 was outclassed in every measurable way: speed, firepower, climb, and dive. American pilots now viewed it not as a threat, but as prey. Over Burma and Indochina, P-51 pilots often described the Hayabusa's appearance in tragic terms. "They came at us with courage, but when you hit them, they just evaporated. One burst and they were gone." The light aluminum skin that once allowed it to dance through the sky now turned to confetti under .5 caliber fire. In Japan's final defense,
The Ki-43 became something its designers had never intended, a weapon of sacrifice. By the spring of 1945, hundreds of Hayabusas were assigned to Tokotai units, the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps. Stripped of radios, guns, and even paint, they carried a single 250-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage. Pilots, many barely 18, were told their aircraft would become the wings of the Emperor's spirit. On April 12, 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, 9 Ki-43 kamikazes from the 72nd Shinbu Squadron attacked the U.S. destroyer USS Manard L. Abel. One of them struck the ship amidships, breaking it in half. It was the only recorded sinking of a destroyer by an Army aircraft. The Empire celebrated it as a victory. In truth, it was a requiem. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the last operational Ki-43 squadrons fought over the ruins of their homeland. From bases in Formosa, Kyushu, and the remnants of Manchurian airfields, they scrambled against incoming B-29 superfortresses. Their 12.7mm guns were useless against the armored bombers. Some pilots rammed the giants head-on, detonating their own planes in midair. One such pilot, Lieutenant Shogo Takechi, was seen flying straight into a B-29 over Osaka, tearing off its tail and sending both aircraft plummeting in fire. In the silence that followed, an American gunner whispered, "They're dying like gods." By August 1945, Japan's defeat was total. The few remaining Hayabusas lay scattered across airfields, burned, riddled with holes, or stripped for parts. The war that had begun with graceful aerial duels ended in suicide dives and ash. When U.S. occupation forces arrived, they found hundreds of Ki-43s abandoned under camouflage nets or hidden in barns, their paint faded, their once proud emblems of the rising sun flaking away in the rain. American engineers who inspected them again were astonished by how primitive they seemed compared to late-war fighters. One report said bluntly, "They look like they belong in 1939. Yet amid the wreckage, there was respect. Well, he fought beyond the limits of reason, wrote a U.S. Navy analyst. The airplane was obsolete, but the men flying it were not. They simply ran out of time. After the war, surviving examples were shipped to the United States, Britain, and Australia for testing. A few were kept in museums, most were scrapped. But for those who flew it on both sides, the Hayabusa remained unforgettable. Allied pilots admired its elegance. Japanese veterans revered it as the embodiment of courage. One former pilot of the 50th Sentai, interviewed in 1962, said softly, "It was light because it carried no fear. When you flew it, you felt alive until the end." The legacy of the Ki-43 Hayabusa is not written in tonnage destroy or missions won. It lies in what it represented, the belief that man and machine could be one, that skill and spirit could overcome steel and fire. It was the last true samurai sword of the sky, built in an age when warfare was becoming mechanical and impersonal. Strategically, its story became a warning. Japan's reliance on the ideal of the perfect pilot, rather than the mass production of survivable machines, proved fatal. While American factories produced thousands of rugged aircraft like the Hellcat, Corsair, and Mustang, Japan continued to design fighters as extensions of a romantic ideal, beautiful, deadly, and doomed. The fall of the Hayabusa marked the moment when the balance of war shifted irreversibly towards industry and pragmatism. When historians today look at its slender frame, they see not failure but tragedy. A masterpiece built for a kind of war that no longer existed. The Ki-43 fought until there were no skies to fight in, until its very lightness, once its freedom, became its tomb. And yet, in the flicker of archival footage, when that delicate falcon rises into the morning light one last time, banking over a lost empire, it still seems to whisper what its pilots once believed, that courage, even in defeat, can still touch the sky.